On today's episode,
I think especially in the aftermath of a tragedy, you have people that want to do what we call target hardening.
Yeah.
So they want to invest in all these physical security measures, like more door locks, metal detectors, and not to say that those cannot be effective, but what they're not paying attention to is the psychological safety. And unfortunately, what we still see in many places is that over focus and spending thousands and thousands of dollars on physical safety.
Yeah.
But yet we've had 3 deaths by suicide in the past 2 years, and we still don't have a suicide prevention program.
Right.
Or we don't have threat assessment teams in place.
Welcome back to Well Informed, the podcast where we dive deep into critical issues surrounding school safety, mental health, and the pathways to preventing violence. Today, we're honored to have Dr. Melissa Reeves with us, an expert in school psychology, threat assessment, and crisis prevention. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Very exciting to have you here. It's nice that we actually are able to catch you.
Yeah, life's a little crazy and busy these days.
I can
but
imagine.
Out there trying to do the good work.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things I love to talk about is travel. And to somebody who is a seasoned travel vet, I think it's an interesting world to get into because, so again, Teresa, she also travels quite a bit, but she'll even show me when we're going to places where we're on standby for, flights, or she's on standby for first class upgrade. She's like, listen, I'm at the bottom here, and you know how much I travel. So think about for Melissa how much she travels, which is insane. But, it takes a certain type of person to be able to do that, I think, and there's some ins and outs. So travel stories are my favorite, but when we talk about the travel for work, just to give folks a brief overview of what is it that you travel so much to do and teach.
Yeah. So I pretty much am on the road almost every single week. Sometimes it can be upwards of 2 to 3 different cities. And what I typically do is I'm doing professional development either for conferences. Most of my work, I would say, is with school districts or state Department of Educations, primarily focusing on school safety topics. So obviously, one of my big passion areas is threat assessment, but also tied into that is suicide risk assessment. But then I'm also one of the co-authors of the Prepare School Crisis Prevention and Intervention Curriculum. So basically, that is published by the National Association of School Psychologists. We've now been, I believe, almost in all 50 states and up to at least 7 international countries. And what that curriculum does is the one-day workshop really teaches school districts and school teams how to build good emergency operations plans, for which having a threat assessment team is a critical component to a good emergency operations plan. And then the 2-day workshop is really focused on what we call multi-tiered mental health and crisis interventions in the aftermath of a situation that has happened. Anything from car accidents to bus accidents, swatting. We teach interventions that were used after schools were swatted.
Yeah.
And then also larger scale events like natural disasters and school shootings. So what we're really trying to focus on is not only the prevention aspect, how do we prevent and protect as best as we can, but also when concerns are brought forward, like, for example, threat and suicide risk assessment, or if there is a crisis situation, how can we have really good crisis interventions and supports that are appropriate for the age groups that we work with in schools, but also staff and parents need supports to mitigate that traumatic impact.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
Too busy these days.
That's the thing, right? And
Yeah.
it's a job that I don't think is ever going to go away yet.
Yeah.
But hey, the idea is that hopefully we're out of business, but
That's what I tell people all the time is I would love to work my way out of a job. But I think, for me, not only is it a passion area of mine because I was one of the responders to Columbine, which is really what put my career path on the trajectory of school safety, but it's the fact that I had over almost 20 years working in the school systems. And so I'm able to take all that boots on the ground experience and now really translate that into making really good systems changes and really building good protocols.
yeah.
So,
And I think, when people hear that Columbine, one of their first responders, how did that kind of tragedy shape the realm of school safety and threat assessment now?
yeah, well, I remember the day that Columbine happened, and those were back in the days where some of us were wearing pagers.
Right.
So I had a pager that had been assigned by my school district, and my pager went off. And I just remember thinking, oh my gosh, like this is in our backyard, because this was a neighboring school district. And then receiving a call from one of my school psychology colleagues saying, hey, can you and a couple others come and help us out? And one of my first assignments was actually at one of the local emergency room waiting areas at one of the local hospitals. And they basically said, just show up here and provide support. And I remember thinking, okay, I've worked really hard for these letters behind my name.
Yeah.
I have a PhD. I'm a nationally certified school psychologist. I'm a licensed professional counselor, and walked into that situation going, I have no idea what I'm doing.
Wow.
And no one ever trained us for this. I realized very quickly that all my therapeutic counseling training, which was helpful, but that's really different than crisis response work. And that was really kind of the seminal moment when I said, we have got to do better. And I was very fortunate to work for a school district back then where we had a fabulous superintendent who said, you know what, this could have been us. So we need to start doing our due diligence and, put together a safety committee. We were one of the first districts in Colorado to actually put together a standardized threat suicide assessment protocols, doing comprehensive safety planning. And so I was fortunate too to work with some incredible colleagues that really helped kind of shape where my career is now.
So I think obviously one of the facets of this training is you must see so many different approaches to school safety, whether it be public schools or private schools as well. What are some of those kind of differences that you notice throughout, all over the country?
Yeah, well, it varies tremendously. And I'll be honest with you, I think a lot of it really depends who is put in the positions to do school safety. And I see a lot of people that might have safety and security background being put into like a director of school safety, but they have never worked a day in their life in schools. And not to say that there can't be some effectiveness of still doing the job, but schools are very unique environments and they have their own climate and cultures. And many of the individuals that I will say come from other safety and security entities, they're very used to kind of this top-down approach. You have a hierarchical structure and a higher up says, this is what you're going to do when you do it.
Yeah.
Well, schools, we are all about multidisciplinary collaboration and problem solving. And so when I talk to a lot of my safety and security folks that have come from those other entities, they're like, this is the hardest job I've ever had. Because I'm used to being in a structure that when someone says, does it, you do it. And someone says, show up to this training, you clear your calendar and you do it. And schools don't operate that way. You have committees and you need to get different opinions, and professional development days you might only get a couple times a year. And if you want people to clear calendars, you better be at least 3 to 4 months out. And they're like, wow, this is like a whole different world. So a lot of it does kind of depend where they're coming from and can they successfully make that transition? Or is this someone who has worked in schools that really understands that whole multidisciplinary, kind of approach? I would also say I think especially in the aftermath of a tragedy, you have people that want to do what we call target hardening.
Yeah.
So they want to invest in all these physical security measures, like more door locks, metal detectors, and not to say that those cannot be effective, but what they're not paying attention to is the psychological safety.
Right.
And that is all about climate and culture and addressing the mental health needs of your students and your staff too these days. And what are we doing for bullying prevention, suicide prevention, teaching pro-social skills, regulation skills? That's all the psychological safety stuff. And unfortunately, what we still see in many places is that over-focus and spending thousands and thousands of dollars on physical safety.
Yeah.
But yet we've had 3 deaths by suicide in the past 2 years, and we still don't have a suicide prevention program.
Right.
Or we don't have threat assessment teams in place. Yeah.
And that's something I see as well. Obviously being on the other side of the border where we are, right, there's still, what I noticed, lots of different approaches to school safety, whether it's here or, in the United States. And that target hardening is a lot, of course, bigger in the United States. And it's not to disparage any company, because you will have to respond to a crisis, and whatever we can do to mitigate the effects of that crisis is needed. But I see so many different approaches to that. And for us, over the border, for those who may be listening, we're watching it in Canada, we see those commercials of whether it's the bulletproof backpacks or blankets or the shelters that you can pull in, or pull out inside the classrooms. Right. And those are things, for folks who are just outside of at that realm of school safety, just kind of go over our heads in terms of like, how is that even needed? Why is that needed?
And if we did more of the psychological safety piece, we wouldn't need as many of those target hardening. And that's what I say, again, a balance of both is important, but you can target harden your school all you want. If someone is hell bent on doing an act of harm to self or harm to others, they're still going to find a way to do it. Yeah. So what is our best, metal detector? Actually, you've heard the term, people say mental detector.
Right.
Like, we've got to have a climate and culture where you have individuals looking out for each other. Yeah. And when you notice someone struggling, you see someone posting something on a social media site that is concerning, you come forward to a trusted adult. You're not getting someone in trouble, you're getting them help. But what I also see, especially through the threat assessment world, or lack thereof in many cases, is that when concerns are brought forward, they're immediately jumping to suspension or expulsion without, for example, doing a good threat assessment. First of all, that doesn't tell us the why. Second of all, you haven't even verified that the accusations are factual. And now with the introduction of technology and AI, we are seeing cases where individuals are being set up by other individuals because they want them kicked out of school. Yeah. And that is going to be our best form of prevention and protection, is when people see something of concern, they feel comfortable coming forward. But if all we're doing is kicking kids out every single time they bring forward a concern, kids are going to stop coming forward. Yeah. I don't want to get my friend kicked out of school, or maybe it's not really what I think it is, and I don't want to see him get in trouble, so they're going to stop coming forward. So we have to really shift to more of that intervention approach and not that separation or expulsion approach.
And that's one of the things we talk about in I'm sure you mentioned your training, we mentioned in our training and our new training that we have. It's the idea of, what do you think that does to somebody who may be on what we call the pathway to violence, right, which is somebody who does have some sort of perceived injustices or grievances against a specific target or site. So that removal from that particular site, it also adds justification for them. That's potentially why we see schools become justifiable targets in these cases. And to your point, it's the mental detectors. We call them the human detectors. Be the best human detectors. And I think one of the things we try to push so much is that that psychological safety, a lot of those things can be done for free.
Absolutely. That part, it's all about connectedness and relationships. And I remember listening to a podcast, and I don't even remember who it was, but they were talking about like targeted violence. And the person says, happy people don't kill people. And I was like, wow. A simple statement, but how true, right? That if you feel connected and you feel like people care and you have relationships and, you have supports when you're going through difficult times, you don't have a desire to want to harm others. And it doesn't cost money to build relationships. And yeah, you're absolutely right. That is really where it comes down to it, is what are we doing to build the relationships and the connectedness so these individuals don't want to harm anybody. And when we separate them from a school environment, we've just now given them more justification. Yeah. We increase grievances. We are human beings and we are social. Like we are designed to live in a pack. And if we can't get that socialization in school, because you've now separated me from school, they're going to get it online. And we know what some of these individuals are doing online and the negative influences. Now, I'm not saying that they're always going to be back in the general education setting without supervision, because there is that balance between how do we meet the needs for the individual but school safety. But we need to really be creative and be thinking about how can we develop appropriate programming with supervision, monitoring, interventions, and supports that keep them connected. And I mean, I was just in a training the other day and a principal said to me, yeah, but if I don't expel and then something happens, it's on me.
Right.
And I said, you know what? It's going to be on you anyway. Because if you do expel, you're going to have people that will come back and say, if you wouldn't have expelled, and we could have kept them where there was eyes and ears and lessened their opportunity to plan an attack and actually carry it out, maybe it wouldn't have happened either.
Yeah.
I said, so I'm going to be honest with you, to some extent in schools, we're damned if we do, damned if we don't. But what's most important is when the concern was brought to your attention, did we do everything we could do? Okay, foreseeability, now we're talking negligence, right? Did we do everything we could do to try to get interventions and supports in place to work with the parents if they're uncooperative? Can we make a report to Child Protective Services, engage law enforcement? I said, that is what people are going to be looking at.
Yeah.
It's none of us can 100% prevent all acts of harm, but just expelling them is not a defensible intervention.
And there is litigious aspects to that too.
Absolutely.
And schools can absolutely be held liable for not following through with those protocols and policies.
Right.
So.
And I was, I've started to do a lot more expert witness work and kind of, looking at how to, particularly for threat assessment, how do we make the process legally defensible? So, in my interactions with a lot of educational attorneys, I remember one of them said to me, I can defend action. What I can't defend is inaction.
Right.
So again, not addressing the concern, or we're just going to kick them out of school and say we're done. I can't defend that.
Yeah.
But what I can defend is if you try to do all of these things, and even, God forbid, if something happened, that is a much easier defense to say, we tried everything we could within the resources and the authority that we have, and we tried to engage those parents.
One of the really interesting things about this behavioral threat assessment world, my mind goes to a book I've read called Trigger Points by Mark Fullman. One of the really interesting points that I picked out from there is the research about threat assessment and the, for lack of a better term, effectiveness. Because we know that there is research, lots of years of research that goes into what are some of those key warning signs, essentially, when somebody is on the pathway to violence. But it's so hard to quantify the, if we've done these interventions and managements, how do we know for sure? Like, how can we keep track of, maybe they wouldn't have done that or those things. So There's some people who will question the effectiveness of threat assessment and will call it, in what we've seen in some cases, kind of that pathway or that pipeline to prison. So what do you think about those?
Yeah, well, and it's one of those that, do we need more research in this area? Absolutely. We definitely need more research. The challenging parts of that research is that, first of all of us that are boots on the ground working in the schools do not have big funding sources and a whole big research consortium behind us, right?
Yeah.
That typically resides more at university levels. Yes. And so, and then a lot of those universities who do this kind of research are having to write grant funds. So then it's all up to what funding is out there for particular research, and then trying to find researchers that also have the boots on the ground, understand what it's like to work in schools, that they're not just researchers, but do they understand how to actually apply this? Right. So yes, there are some challenges to research, but what I will also say is one of the biggest challenges is that it's hard to measure what doesn't happen. So exactly. We have, I can just tell you right now, today as we're taping this, it is the anniversary of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas.
Yes.
And on my phone, just of the cases I'm aware of people that I know across the U.S., there have been 3 school shootings thwarted in the past week.
Yeah. Because
of students planning an attack. Somebody brought it forward, some of them to school officials, some to local law enforcement, one went to a tip line. They engaged, and they prevented it from happening. So, but how do you measure those across the country? Exactly. I can tell you they're happening all the time, that we are preventing these things. But it's hard, first of all, it's hard to measure something that doesn't happen.
Exactly. And you don't hear about that on the news.
Exactly. They only want the ones that do happen, right?
Yeah.
But what I can tell you is that the U.S. Secret Service National Threat Assessment Center has done over 20 years of qualitative research. And what I like about that is that they have gotten in and done some really in-depth case study analyses. They've actually even interviewed some of these perpetrators in jail. And what were some of the contributing factors? But also, just as importantly, was there anything that could have mitigated this? Is there anything that might have stopped it? They've also done a study on thwarted attacks, those that were planned but were stopped. All of that research we are using to shape really good best practices, particularly when it comes to K-12 threat assessment.
Yes.
Also, there's been some research put out there by Dr. Dewey Cornell that shows the effectiveness of this process for outcomes. So when threat assessment is done the right way, okay, you're following best practices using that multidisciplinary team, it leads to more positive interventions like mental health supports, academic supports, less punitive consequences, and less restrictive placements. So actually, a good threat assessment process mitigates the school to prison pipeline and mitigates disproportionality. That's what the research has shown. Now, do we need more? Absolutely. But that's what the research has shown. But yeah, there are narratives saying that this process feeds the school to prison pipeline, and the research just doesn't support that. And I'm telling you, I've seen it personally working cases that when we can get this process in place, our goal is to prevent them ending up in the judicial system or to prevent suspension, expulsion, or more restrictive placements, if at all possible. That's the goal, intervention and support.
Absolutely. Like the threat assessment process is really just wanting those kids to still succeed.
Yes.
And that's exactly it. And the idea of that is looking at just the data, just the facts of the case, of the particular behaviors that have occurred. And one of the things that we see, to your point, when the threat assessment process is followed, a good threat assessment that involves a multidisciplinary team, that involves multiple people coming together, because there are times and cases where there is one person making a decision and they're not looking at kind of the rest of the details. It's kind of collecting all the information of the puzzle pieces before we put them together. And a lot of the times, again, on news media, you'll see this, that they just kind of snapped. They just, and that's your point of happy people don't kill people.
Right. And they don't just snap. There's like a precursor to all of this. So how do we recognize some of those indicators and get in and engage before they get to the point of wanting to make a threat? And at least for the K-12 population, for so many of these kids, it's a cry for help. That when you really get in there and you start working the threat assessment process and we start peeling back some of these onion layers, you realize they are under tremendous stress in regards to life circumstances. They may have trauma histories, some incredible stressors going on at home. Sometimes there's been substance use or abuse, either themselves or within the family. They don't have a lot of support systems. And trust me, if they really didn't want you to know, there wouldn't be what we call leakage.
Yes.
So if they are putting things online, they're putting things on social media, they're making statements to their friends that things are not okay, what they're saying is, I want somebody to notice me. And most of the time when we get in there and we work this process, they do break down and say, I don't really want to harm people, but I just don't know what else to do. Or I just wanted the bullying to stop. Or we now, unfortunately, at least in the US, we have been confiscating weapons off school campuses this year at record levels. And one of the big questions I always get is, well, we know we're going to have to look at expulsion, especially if they bring a gun or a longer bladed weapon to school. That's what the rules say, right? So why do we still need to do a threat assessment? And I say, because you need to understand the why. Why did they have this weapon at school? And in the majority of those cases, it was not what we call predatory violence, where they were intending to use it and they were methodically planning. It was what we call reactive violence. There is some situation they don't feel safe. And a lot of them, it's to and from school, especially in certain communities. So the reason they had the weapon was not with the intent of using it, but it was protection if they're threatened. And there was one case in a school district last month where this was a middle school kid who was found with a knife in his backpack. And it was the parent that told him to put the knife in the backpack because of some neighborhood issues going on. And this kid didn't feel safe walking to and from school. But that was the only way he could get to school was to walk. They did not have a car. So now he's up for expulsion. And it was the parent saying, I need you to protect yourself. And this poor kid is like, what am I supposed to do? And so now I'm like, okay, can we look at alternatives to expulsion? Like, again, we can't excuse the behavior, but we've got to intervene here.
How about just a safe ride to school?
Right. Expelling this kid is not going to help his pathway to life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And you mentioned earlier a little bit about, traumatic environments. You've done extensive work on trauma in the educational system. So can you talk a little bit about how trauma affects the childhood brain in that K-12 environment?
Yeah. So, kind of more in simple terminology, because trauma obviously can be really complex. But when you have had a significant trauma history, now for some, it might be more of like a one-time really traumatic event that you've been through, like a car accident or an event of targeted violence. There's others that are what we call, that have been exposed to toxic stress, which is basically they're living in toxic stress environments almost every single day, or there's been generational trauma that has occurred. There is research to show it does change brain development. And you are not as regulated. You are more sensitive to threat cues. So when you, for example, you might hear a noise of something dropping and think nothing of it.
Yeah.
Because if you don't have a trauma history, okay, so it's just a loud noise, maybe it's a book that fell. But to someone with a trauma history, that noise might be a trauma activator of like reminding them of a gunshot that had gone off, or that it was a door slamming, and that means that the perpetrator, if they've been in an abusive situation, is now headed down the hallway. That then activates our system. And then for many of them, I've got to protect myself.
Yeah.
So they come across as being more dysregulated. And a lot of times, unfortunately, then they're in the office for a discipline referral. So for example, I had a kiddo with a pretty significant trauma history, and he was constantly being referred to the office for disciplinary problems because he would go off, right?
Yeah.
So I go in and I do classroom observations. Well, what I found out is when I watched how the teacher approached him, because trauma also impacts the ability to concentrate and focus in the classroom, is when he wasn't doing his work, the teacher was getting in his physical space, standing over, pointing the finger at him, and then basically saying, get this done or else you can't go to lunch, go to recess. So that for him was a trauma activator. So what does he do? He either pushes back the teacher, so now we have physical aggression, or verbal aggression, and then now he's in the office for an office referral. Well, all we needed to do was for me to go in, do some consulting with the teacher about a trauma-informed approach.
Yep.
This is a different way to approach him. Let's work on that. You've got to be careful of personal space. Also did some work with him on regulation skills. They developed a signal that if that teacher was too close, he gave her a signal, and then the teacher knew to back off.
Yeah.
Next thing you know, boy, the number of office referrals significantly decreased.
Yeah.
So it's things like that, that we really can. There's this whole trauma-sensitive, trauma-informed movement that we can set up classrooms to be much more adaptive to those that might have those kind of trauma histories. And then hopefully we're not doing threat assessments because they don't end up in the threat assessment process.
Right, and that's the thing. It's there's obviously lists of behaviors that could potentially activate a threat assessment, but the point is to figure out the why. And if we find out that, there is a extensive trauma history here,
Right.
we know that the intent is not to harm individuals. This is the original cry for help. And one of the things we teach during our trainings is that the good news is that majority of the threat assessment cases that teams do, they're not going to move forward because we are going to find out that there is no intent. There is no capacity for this, or the means are just not there, but it's just collecting information before doing that. And the trauma, the extensive trauma or what goes in and uncovering those things can really help get that student along more of that positive pathway.
Absolutely. And when this is done the right way, it really is a partnership between the school and the parents or the caregivers. And I know when I was doing a training last week, I had another participant that says, so I think what I'm hearing you say is we shouldn't suspend and then do the threat assessment. And I was like, exactly. Yeah. No, you don't do that. And they're like, oh, well, that's what we've been doing. I said, along with a lot of other schools, right? I'm like, because first of all, you've already made a judgment call without collecting the data to see what's really going on here. Second of all, you've separated them now from the school. So how can you do a good threat assessment when you don't have them to talk to you? Now, I'm not saying they're going to be back in class unsupervised.
Yeah.
But we had a protocol where we had a separate room. We made sure other kids couldn't see them through a window, because then kids are like, ooh, so-and-so's in trouble, right? So we kept an adult in the room with them. They were not allowed to have access to cell phones or electronic devices. And we had a conversation or an interview. If they shut down, get ready for it, because they're scared a lot of times. We kept the adult in the room, but we let them have space. Again, coming at that from more that trauma-informed approach.
Yeah.
We gave them space as the rest of the multidisciplinary team is collecting data. And a lot of times, our goal was, is there anybody else in the building they trust that we could bring back into the room and maybe break through some of these barriers and get them to open up? And a lot of the times we could find at least one person. And then when we reapproach them in an empathetic way, wow, it sounds like life has been really hard lately. Or we just found out there's been some significant conflict between this other group of kids and you. And it sounds like they've kind of targeted you. Or, we just found out that you lost your grandma. It sounds like she really meant a lot to you. We are here to help. We break down those barriers.
Yeah.
So keeping them while we do the process under supervision facilitates. Also, why would a parent cooperate with you if you're going to kick their kid out or suspend them right off the bat before you've even looked into this?
Yes.
So you're now coming to me as a parent saying, we want to work with you, and we're going to ask some sensitive personal questions about what's going on in the family and at home, but you just suspended my kid. Why would I trust you?
Yeah.
So we're really having to shift that you work the process before you make any what I call management decisions. And management is intervention, supervision, monitoring, supports, services. And when we do that and we take the time to give that student and their parent a voice, and we take the time to understand the situation, they are more likely to collaborate and be partners with us, because parent engagement in the process is critical. And if, God forbid, we have to look at a consequence because they violated, say, a district policy or a state law, they are more likely to accept the disciplinary action without escalating grievances when they feel like they have been treated fairly and that they have been heard.
Yeah.
So again, how we do this process is so critical.
Absolutely. It's really interesting. So one of our other guests is one of our other trainers we had, Chris Felton, and he talks about in his session for Gangs and Guns, he's going to be talking about procedural justice for how that helps solve crimes, basically.
Yeah.
And what it boils down to is just building connections with the individuals who you're talking to, and forming, getting more involved in the community, and having, people understand what that process looks like. So one of the things that I'm noticing right now is that, especially in our province, so we've launched, our race, which is Expect, Respect, and a Safe Education strategy in 2012, and there's been so much training that's been done in the past 14, 15 years now in that world, in that space, and one of the things that we see is that there's a lot of turnover. There's a lot of, while in this world we continue to evolve and learn and grow, back in the actual boots on the ground, it's really just continuing to go back to kind of square one for that. And there is a lot of, in terms of who gets taught threat assessment, it's usually principals, vice principals, school psychologists, mental health, school resource officers, but not necessarily some of the staff members, teachers. And one of the things we're really trying to work on is how can we get broader sense of what a threat assessment actually is.
Right.
And because there is that connotation of behavioral threat assessment, it sounds that it is this very almost kind of punitive process that goes along with it.
Yeah, and that's where I think we have not done a good job. And I say we, like, just is the profession in general, is we have not done a good job of educating our teachers, our support staff, our parent and caregiver communities on what threat assessment is and what it's not. And so when you hear the term threat assessment, it is a scary thing. So I understand where you might have a teacher saying, well, you just did a threat assessment on this kid. I don't feel safe with them coming back in my class. Or a parent saying, you're doing a threat assessment on my kid. You just want to kick him out. I'm not going to say anything.
Yeah.
because they don't know what the process is. And if you don't know what a process is, you can't trust the process. So we collectively, I think, need to do a much better job of educating our educators on what this is, what it's not, and what are the steps we take when we do a threat assessment. And if they're going to remain back in school in some capacity, which is the goal, it is only after very careful a very careful consideration with appropriate monitoring, supervision, and supports put in place. And you're part of that team. And the same with parents, that, again, this is not to kick your kid out. It's to identify contributing factors and can we put any supports in place. But we've got to educate them on what that is, whether it's back to school nights, parent information nights through a parent newsletter. And we're not really doing that well. And I'll be honest with you, I've been asked for a long time now, well, do you have like a 1 to 1.5 hour presentation you can do for staff? And I've been so busy with so many other things. But in August, I've had 2 schools now that in one state that have said, can we do it virtual, hour to an hour and a half, and can you just educate our teachers and staff on what threat assessment is and what their role is in the process. And I said, okay, let's get it on the calendar because now I have to develop it. So if I have a deadline, it's going to get done. But yes, and also being able to develop some parent information sources. Like we have some really good handouts. Like the National Association of School Psychologists has put together a great handout on best practices in K-12 behavioral threat assessment and management. But reading a document doesn't necessarily mean you understand the process. So we need to definitely do a better job in that area because we want parents to be partners.
And it's one of the things I say is that, school safety is not just your responsibility. It's not just parents' responsibility. It's not just students. It's everybody. So how do we make sure that each one of those stakeholders has the appropriate resources and the knowledge to know what that process actually is and looks like? And one of the interesting things, if we go back to the trauma-informed approach, there's so many things that I've learned in the past few years about just changing some of that language for certain things. Like when we talk about a triggering event, even that word triggering could potentially be triggering. So
trauma activator is
exactly
one of the
one of the
words
things
we're using.
Has activated a strong emotional response, which gets the same thing across. I was listening to Michelle Gay and Joe McKenna talk about their Staying Safe program, and one of the things where we talk about what's more of a neutral term, escape or go, right? And it totally makes sense. And one of the other trainings we were doing, we look at, again, for that emergency preparedness, a hold and secure versus a lockout or a lockdown. Hold and secure, I've seen some districts, instead of calling it that hold and secure, just hold and teach. And that's been really cool to see.
The shift in the language, it makes such a big difference.
And because the practice doesn't change, it's just how we perceive that language, which is really interesting.
Well, and that's the other unique part in schools, is that we work with a lot of different developmental age groups, and we work with kids that have various disabilities. So the language that you're using for a kindergartner is going to be different than what you use in high schools. And that is one of I think the most important pieces of our expert educators and school mental health professionals always being at the forefront of any of this work, because we are specifically trained in development. And you can't take someone who's been working with adults their whole life and throw them into a school environment and expect those skills to translate. Like most of my master's program, it was more clinical focused, and it was a lot of working with adults. And one of the reasons why I went back into school psychology for my PhD is because I'm like, that world is really different than working back in schools with kids. And, I want to be, because I started off as a special ed teacher. And how do we, it's different. And so, taking all of those developmental considerations into best practices is absolutely critical in the academic environment. It cannot be a one-size-fits-all approach. But it doesn't change the practices. Just how do we teach it in a way that is understandable, but also not scary? Yeah,
exactly. We need a way to get you in every single school. And I think that's probably why you travel so much. So, I mean, I love hearing other people's travel stories. So completely unrelated to everything we've been talking about. You travel you're probably the most seasoned travel vet that I've met. So again, that's why it's so fantastic to actually have you here in person, which is so great. I'm just curious, is there any kind of travel story that jumps out as the most scary, interesting, exciting, weird? Because there's so many. There's
I mean, not really. But here's what I will say. I mean, not gonna lie, having travel experience helps. So for example, trying to make my way here to Vancouver, right? Flying out of Detroit, I did a training all day. So the only way for me to get to Vancouver was to go from Detroit to Toronto and then land in Vancouver at 1 a.m. Pacific time, which would be pretty much traveling all night, right?
Yeah.
So snow in Detroit, and I didn't really pay attention to the Toronto weather, but that was my connecting city. And so I'm like, okay, I rarely ever check a bag. No, okay, that is the one travel tip. Never check a bag unless you absolutely have to. But you have to learn how to pack strategically.
Yes.
But I'm gone for 12 days this time with 2 national conferences. So I check a bag. But I'm thinking, weather forecast not looking good. So I'm going to be smart, take all my toiletries and at least 1 day of dress clothes with me in a carry-on, everything else in the checked bag. Thank goodness I did. We're on the plane. We're getting ready to pull away from, the gate. Then the agent comes back on and says, folks, you're not going to like this flight canceled. So here I am. And what I've learned is you be nice to people.
Yeah.
If you go up to the gate agents and you start demanding, they have no desire to work with you.
Yeah.
If you are nice, you understand this is not their fault. They're just doing their job. You get a lot further. So anyway, to make a long story short, I end up in Seattle, sleepless in Seattle for the night, make my way to Vancouver, but my bag ended up in Atlanta. So I did finally get it at 10 o'clock last night. But I think my greatest travel advice is always think ahead and always have something in a carry-on that at least can get you through the next day.
Yeah.
So, and be nice. I've had frustrations with TSA because I pack the same dang bag all the time. Sometimes it stops, sometimes it's not. But the bottom line is they're doing their job.
Yeah.
Right? It's all about safety. So,
exactly.
Human kindness goes a long way in these professions because not everybody is nice these days.
No, that's very true. If you were to leave parents, caregivers, staff, police officers, anybody listening to this right now, kind of one piece of advice for just safety, school safety in general, mental wellness in general, what would something you would want everybody to know?
It takes all of us. And I know that whole "it takes a village" is a cliche that's probably overused, but it truly does. And we're going to get so much further when we all work together and we find a way for all of our systems to interconnect versus people working in different silos and that zero tolerance approach. That just punishment alone does not change behavior. It's how do we all work together? So it's all about collaboration and relationships. And if we can all do that as adults and find a way to come at these concerns with how do we help change to a more positive pathway, that's how we're going to keep not only our schools but also our communities safe.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Melissa, thank you so much for being on here
Thank you
today.
for having me.
Absolute pleasure. And can't wait to see. We'll get you on next time whenever we catch you again.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Awesome.